So what I'm going to do is take us through the typical procedure for preparing an NMR sample to run. And there's two types of samples. If your sample is liquid, then obviously it's the easiest one to do, so I'll try that first. So let's pretend that we wanted to run acetone, typical liquid. And the way that we do that, and I'll show you, very simple. You simply put in your liquid straight as it is, right? And I'll show you guys in a second here. You can see how that all you need, I want to make sure we get a decent look at that. You only need about 1 inch, inch and a quarter of liquid. That's all that you need so that this sits in the appropriate section of the probe on the NMR instrument. And I'll show you this sheet of paper here in a second. What I've actually done, and then of course you put your lid on here. So any liquid samples, if you have enough of your liquid, fill it up to 1 inch, inch and a quarter. If you only have a certain amount of liquid sample in your round bottom flask that you have, you can always make up the difference using deuterated chloroform, or if it's not soluble, dimethyl sulfoxide that's deuterated. But on the paper here, it'll show you how much liquid you ultimately have to have in there. So for liquid samples, and if you have enough, very easy, you just fill up your NMR tube to 1 inch and a quarter, and away you go, and I'll label that. For solids, quite a bit different. So just for example, I'm going to take benzyl, and I'm going to run that. So the way that this works is, you're going to measure out the required 1 to 1.5 inches of your deuterated solvent, which will be chloroform in this case. And the idea is this: you want to try and dissolve as much of your solid that will possibly go into that 1 to 1.25 inches of your solvent. Okay, you want to supersaturate your NMR sample in the deuterated solvent. Okay, so what I usually recommend is if you have this nice little 10 milliliter beaker, it's kind of convenient. So the first order of business, I'll get a clean disposable pipette here. So I'll take the NMR solvent, and if you take your disposable pipette, and you'll get used to doing this, you don't have to do it. I have a disposable pipette over here on the, I'm gonna bring that right over there and show you, right over there. So you can see here, this is an NMR tube, and right on this white piece of paper, it shows you how much you should fill up your NMR tube when you're done. And if you're going to be getting some deuterated chloroform, it actually has a disposable pipette taped on here with a black line that says you can take up this much, and that'll deliver the 1.25 inch of solvent for your tube. So it's a nice measuring device that's right there for you guys. Okay. So what I usually do is this. I'll take up that sort of pre-measured amount of deuterated chloroform, if that's my solvent I'm using every day. Okay, so I've got that in the 10 mil, and then what I'll do is I'll literally just try and supersaturate. I normally start with at least a green pea-sized amount, at least that much, dump it in here, and what I'll do at first is I'll just gently swirl it. In this benzyl compound, I'm not even stirring it with a glass stir bar, I'm not trying to break up the crystals, and that green pea-sized amount has seemingly just dissolved right in. So it's very, very soluble, which is great. What I'm going to do though is, I'm going to supersaturate it. So I'm going to add enough that it can no longer take any more. Because a lot of your compounds, you're only going to be able to fit in a certain amount. And in those instances, and I'll put my hand on the bottom of this, you can feel how this is a little bit cool. So when it's dissolving, it's cooling down. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll use the heat from my hand to just gently warm this lightly as I'm swirling it. Okay? And I'll keep adding solid compound until the solvent no longer takes anymore. So we've got a few leftover crystals. Just to kind of really demonstrate this, I'll even add a fair bit more. Okay, so let's say you should be able to see some chunks, maybe. See, it's kind of chunky in there. So now I'll demonstrate, in order just to make your NMR sample tube look kind of nice, I'll have one, and of course the rule is, I prefer the 125 mil Erlenmeyer as my NMR tube holder. This way I don't have to have things falling down. And then what we'll do, we'll take another disposable pipette that's clean. I take a small piece of cotton. Some people would argue that you need to use glass wool, which you can. I've never had a problem really, so to speak. I'll take a 9-inch pipette with that longer tip, or a piece of wire if that is, and see how I'm just going to stick that cotton in. I'm just going to firmly push it right into the end. If you super tightly put it in there, it can be so tight, which is fine. You really have to put a disposable pipette bulb on this to squish your solvent through it, which is fine. So notice what I'm going to do. This now becomes your little filtering tube, and you put that in just like that, right? And that'll sit right there. And all we're going to do now is I'm going to transfer this sort of chunky, solid, liquid sample, and I will add it using disposable pipette through this little filtering device, right? And you can see we definitely have chunks of stuff left over. So in my opinion, this chloroform solvent and the sample put in it is essentially supersaturated. And all this does is it lets you get away with running a proton scan. Technically this one, I'm sure of it, one single scan and you got a great looking spectrum. Otherwise, if your solid doesn't like to go in very much at all and it's not very concentrated, I might have to run 8 scans or sometimes 16. So that's the benefit of that. And you can see I definitely did push that little tiny cotton plug quite tight, and that liquid doesn't want to drain fast. I've already got a fair bit through, so I'm just going to lightly put a bulb on the top and I'll squish through what's required. And I put a little too much, which is fine. So you can see there we have a nice 1 to 1.25 inches, and you can measure it up against what I showed you over here to make sure that we have the appropriate depth. But again, 1 to 1.25 inches. If you put in a lot extra, that's not going to hurt anything in the NMR instrument. But if you put too much deuterated chloroform in here, all you're doing is wasting it, because it is an expensive solvent. So that, put your cap, your NMR cap on the top. The other thing you want to do too is you want to make sure that your cap, I mean, see, watch, I can have it tilted. So when you put this in the NMR instrument, it doesn't like to spin evenly. So it's always nice to make sure that your NMR cap looks like it's sitting square on the top, and it's ready to go.